Something new appeared beside the known. For months, 3i, Atlas, had been a solitary traveller, a line of data points stitched across deep sky surveys, predictable in its mystery. But then, between exposures, a second light appeared, smaller, quieter. And yet, impossibly near. It wasn't supposed to be there. At first, astronomers dismissed it as noise a cosmic ray strike, a camera ghost, the kind of phantom that lives in CCD sensors when photons misbehave. But the signature persisted, faint and clean. It moved exactly where 3i, Atlas, moved, like a whisper in its wake. And when they stacked the frames, the whisper became a companion. Somewhere between light and silence, another traveller had joined the journey. The first rule of interstellar objects is loneliness. They come alone, flung from their birth systems by the violence of gravity. Two travellers, one known, one not, drifting together through the dark. No tether, no signal, no shared origin, yet somehow connected. In the language of orbital mechanics, that should be impossible. The odds of two unbound objects aligning their velocity vectors across interstellar space are astronomical in the literal sense, as in 1 in the number of atoms in the galaxy. And yet, there it was, a dim reflection mirroring a path no one else could follow. It wasn't a twin, it wasn't debris, it was something waiting to be noticed. When the first alert reached the minor planet center, the report read simply, "Possible co-moving body detected, under review." No one outside the small circle of researchers paid attention. Space is full of coincidences, of light curves that trick the eye. But deep down, even the most rational minds felt it a quiet unease. The companion's brightness didn't fade with distance. It pulsed. Every few hours, a subtle modulation, as if responding or breathing. There was no known mechanism for that. Not thermal rotation, not reflective tumbling, not solar flare interaction, just pulse. It was as though the universe itself had blinked. The mirror line arrived softly. We thought we were alone in watching it. Perhaps it was watching back. That sentence began to circulate quietly in internal emails, never printed in official logs. Scientists are careful with language, but when the data feels like myth, words bend. Soon, theories multiplied like shadows under starlight. Could 3i, Atlas, have ejected a fragment under solar stress? Could it be a dust clump held together by electrostatic cohesion? Could it, in this one, whispered late at night, be something artificial? No one said it aloud in meetings, but no one could fully dismiss it either. Because the movement was too clean. Because the timing was too precise. Because the silence felt intentional. The graduate student who first noticed it wrote in her private notes, "It behaves like it knows where 3i Atlas is going." That line never appeared in the published abstract, of course. Science does not publish intuition, but intuition often arrives before understanding. She gave it a nickname, Echo, and somehow the name fit. Echo drifted within a narrow corridor of 3i, Atlas's trajectory, always offset by the same angular distance, as if the two were bound by an invisible thread. Not gravitationally, the math ruled that out. Not magnetically. Not by outgassing jets. Just by coincidence too perfect to stay coincidental. The Las Cañadas team tried to capture a spectrum, but the signal was too faint. Still, there was a difference. A slight redshift anomaly, inconsistent with natural reflection. It was subtle, like the breath between two words. A breath between two worlds. In the quiet rooms where telescopes whisper to themselves, researchers began to adjust their exposure windows, not to study 3i Atlas anymore, but to catch what followed it. The companion, the echo, the silent second traveller. It became a ghost chase. Every night, a new data set. Every night, a new failure to explain it away. Then came the night of the flash. A single frame. A single instant. The echo flared not explosively, but luminously, like a slow heartbeat of light. In that moment, 3i, Atlas, dimmed by a fraction of a percent, as if the two objects shared a single pulse of energy. Then darkness again. The next morning, instruments registered a microburst of electromagnetic noise, not enough to qualify as a signal, but structured enough to raise eyebrows. A pattern repeating every 41 seconds for 3 cycles. Then silence. Officially, it was logged as instrumental interference. Unofficially, it was the first time someone whispered the phrase, synced behavior. No one could find a source. No satellite crossed the field. No known solar activity lined up. Just a moment of impossible correlation, 2 lights behaving as one. When the data was plotted, the orbits overlapped not by accident, but by symmetry. The smaller object moved as though preempting 3I, Atlas's motion, adjusting slightly before each turn, predictive, not reactive. It was like watching a dancer move before the music begins, and that's when the idea began to take root, terrifying and beautiful all at once. What if 3I, Atlas, wasn't alone because it was never meant to be? What if the second object was not following, but guiding? The night sky doesn't easily reveal intention, but sometimes the silence between the stars feels rehearsed. By December, telescopes in Hawaii, Chile, and the Canary Islands confirmed the anomaly. The companion existed. Faint, erratic, but undeniably real. The headlines never came, at least not yet. The world had other distractions, and the cosmos rarely competes with the noise of Earth. But among the quiet watchers, the astronomers, the analysts, the poets pretending to be scientists, a feeling grew. A sense that this story was no longer just about trajectories and vectors. It was about recognition, the same way a mirror recognizes what stands before it. The closure arrives quietly, not with revelation, but with reflection. If 3I, Atlas, carried questions about where it came from, the companion now carried questions about why it was here. 2 lights, 2 paths, one mystery doubling itself, and somewhere, in the dark between them, a silent dialogue begins. No words, no signals, just the subtle knowing that in a universe vast enough to forget itself, even loneliness travels in pairs. The data would later show that 3I, Atlas, slightly altered course on the same night. The flash appeared by a degree too small to headline, but too deliberate to ignore, as if responding, as if aware. And from that night on, the observers stopped asking what it was and began wondering what it meant. The first flash didn't come from the comet. It came behind it. In the raw frames, it looked almost accidental. A brief surge of light, a bloom in the pixels just trailing 3I, Atlas's tail. But when the filters were applied, the geometry refused to lie. The burst wasn't aligned with the sun nor with any known reflection angle. It came from a point just beyond the object's wake, as if something invisible had switched itself on. No known comet behaves that way. Nothing natural should emit light from the dark side. The observatory logs from that night show 2 seconds of overexposure. That's all. But in those 2 seconds, a narrative shifted from orbit to intention. Because light in space is never random. At Las Cañadas, when they thought it was a calibration issue, one of those tiny malfunctions caused by atmospheric turbulence or sensor fatigue, but when JPL cross-referenced the timestamp with data from another telescope half a world away, the same flash appeared, different hemisphere, same sky, same second. When coincidence collapses, mystery begins. The spectral readout showed a brief spike around 2.1 microns infrared, not visible, the kind of wavelength produced by heated metal or ionized gas. Yet there was no subsequent glow, no cooling curve, no dispersion tail. It was as if the energy had appeared and vanished without traveling. That's not how photons behave. Some tried to fit it into known categories: transient event, sensor echo, space debris flare, but the timing broke the model. The light came not from 3I, Atlas itself, but from a fixed offset point, tracking behind it with uncanny precision, as though something had followed it across the stars and was now choosing to be seen. The graduate student who'd named the companion Echo wrote another note in her log that night. The flash wasn't from the comet, it was from its shadow. That phrase unsettled her mentor. There was no such thing as a luminous shadow, yet when he overlaid the trajectories, the data refused to yield to reason. The companion wasn't trailing like debris. It maintained perfect distance, like a tether made of absence. For the first time, someone asked the question aloud. Was this light ejected or did it arrive? For decades, astronomers have known that light can reveal intent not in a sentient way, but in the way gravity bends photons into patterns of intelligence. Here, however, the intelligence felt different. It felt like punctuation. Imagine the universe pausing, then blinking. That blink was the flash. Observers began scouring archival data. They found smaller flares weeks earlier, too dim to register as anomalies. Together they formed a rhythm, faint pulses, irregular but deliberate, leading up to the bright flash. Like a countdown, or a signal that had finally reached its turn to speak. The mirror line glows quietly here. Light travels faster than understanding. Because while scientists argued, 3I Atlas shifted, a micro-adjustment, barely measurable, but perfectly synchronized with the flash event, as if it too had received something. A nudge, a message. And that's when the language of the investigation changed. The data ceased being noise. It became response. Forensic photometry was applied next. By stacking frames before and after the flash, analysts reconstructed a faint shape, not a point, but an arc. Curved, smooth, structured. It wasn't solid enough to classify, yet too geometrically consistent to be a random gas. It looked, one scientist said off record, like the edge of something waking up. The phrase spread quietly through the team, half joke, half confession, because the shape had coherence. And coherence means memory. And memory, in deep space, is an act of design. When light behaves as if it remembers where it came from, or you're no longer just studying physics, you're studying intention written in photons. The flash behind 3I, Atlas, lasted only 2 seconds, yet in those 2 seconds, the entire equation of the object changed. Its albedo shifted by 0.02, its rotational vector adjusted, and the faint anti-tail, that strange, sun-facing plume, first reported months earlier, intensified. The cause and effect chain was impossible to confirm, but the symmetry was too perfect to ignore. Something had interacted with it. In the control rooms, silence became its own kind of communication. No one wanted to say it, the word that changes science into speculation, the word that invites ridicule and wonder in equal measure. Intelligence. Because if the flash was sent, not caused, then the companion wasn't just following 3I Atlas. It was communicating with it. The idea hung there like static in the dark. Meanwhile, the public data stream showed nothing unusual. The nightly news mentioned 3I, Atlas as a faint curiosity in the sky, a traveler from interstellar space, poetic, harmless, distant. The flash never made it into press releases. It wasn't censored. It was simply lost in the noise. But within that noise, the pattern continued. By December 8th, 3 more minor flares appeared, always behind the main object, always synchronized within one orbital vector. No increase in brightness, no debris, no sound, just the pulse of existence announcing itself through precision. Each one is smaller, each one is fainter, as though whatever had arrived was adjusting, learning, calibrating, or conserving energy. The next logical step was radar pinging, but deep space radar requires consent from physics itself. The distance was too vast. The signal would take hours, perhaps days, to echo back. Still, they tried. A low-frequency sweep was transmitted through NASA's Goldstone dish, calibrated to the coordinates of the 3I Atlas vector. Nothing returned, not even scatter noise, which, in radio terms, meant one of two things. Either the target was perfectly absorbent, a stealth geometry that swallowed energy, or it wasn't there anymore. Yet optical tracking confirmed both bodies were still moving together. Silence, in this case, was louder than any reply. When humans meet silence, we project meaning. That's how myths begin. And in a way, the story of 3I Atlas's companion became a new kind of myth, one made of raw data and sleepless eyes. The flash behind the object divided belief into 2 camps. The first said, it was ejected a fragment, perhaps charged by internal pressure, creating a transient glow as volatile compounds escaped. Nothing more. The second said, it arrived a distinct entity drawn to 3I Atlas, synchronized by something we do not yet understand. Both sides used math. Both sides were wrong in their own ways, because sometimes truth doesn't live in the equations, it hides in the silence between them. The student stared at the night sky through her monitor and whispered, "It's not moving with the light. It is the light. That line never made it into the journals either, but it stayed in the minds of those who read her notes. Because the flash was not just illumination, it was revelation. A reminder that even in the cold machinery of observation, wonder still finds room to breathe. As days passed, a subtle radiation spike was detected by the Parker Solar Probe, an anomalous uptick in high-energy particles originating from roughly the same direction, too weak to trigger alerts, but measurable. The timing matched the flash event to the minute. Coincidence, perhaps. Or confirmation that something small and deliberate had entered the dance. If light can mark an arrival, then perhaps this was it, the moment the unknown stepped out from behind the curtain of probability. The mirror line returns at the close, soft and precise. We saw a flash, but maybe it saw us first. Because light doesn't only travel outward, it reflects, it records, it remembers the surfaces it touches. Somewhere out there, that brief flare of brightness still moves through the void, carrying our reflection within it, encoded in every photon. Maybe the question was never whether it was ejected or arrived. Maybe the question was, which one of them lit the other? Now the two objects continue, the larger leading, the smaller following, both bound by invisible rhythm. The next flash could come tomorrow, or never. But for those who watched that first burst of light, something fundamental shifted. They began to feel that the universe, once thought indifferent, had blinked, and in that blink, acknowledged us. And maybe that's how contact begins, not with words, but with the sudden, the impossible light behind an object we thought we already understood. It wasn't what they saw that changed everything. It was what they missed between the frames. The cameras had been running for hours, sweeping the void where 3I, Atlas, drifted past the scattered constellations. Each exposure lasted 30 seconds. Each frame was another heartbeat of the universe, captured in pixels. And yet, when they stitched the images together, something impossible emerged. A motion that didn't belong to the time. Between one frame and the next, the companion had moved farther than physics allowed. Too precise for a glitch, too synchronized to be a coincidence. Like something had slipped through the cracks of the observation itself, as if time, for an instant, which had made room for intention. Astronomers are trained to distrust mystery. Every flicker has an explanation. Cosmic rays, thermal expansion, processing artifacts. But when you've ruled out every failure and the pattern remains, disbelief starts to sound like superstition. They checked every variable. The CCD temperature, the bias frames, the readout noise. Nothing explained it. The motion appeared deliberate, premeditated, almost scripted. The frames didn't just show a path. They showed a choice. In the dim light of the observatory, the graduate student stared at the data until her eyes burned. She replayed the stacked sequence on loop, adjusting contrast, aligning the stars, subtracting the background glow. The faint dot the companion moved in clean rhythm beside 3I Atlas. Then, mid-sequence, it jumped. Not wildly, but precisely a relocation by a fixed angular measure, perfectly in sync with the main object's acceleration phase. A microburst of velocity without cause. If it were debris, the shift would be chaotic. If it were ice, it would drift. But this looked like navigation, she whispered to herself. It's editing its own path. The discovery unsettled even the veterans. Objects don't edit trajectories. They follow physics. They yield to forces. But this one seemed to anticipate them. JPL's orbital simulation couldn't reproduce the jump. Every attempt ended in noise, divergence, entropy. Only when they artificially introduced predictive modeling motion calculated before 3I Atlas moved did the data align again. That's when one of the analysts said, almost afraid to hear it aloud, "It's not reacting, it's leading." The words hung in the air like a confession. Between the frames, the universe had revealed a secret choreography. Two bodies moving as one mind. At first, the assumption was gravitational coupling, perhaps microfragmentation, but even that broke down under scrutiny. The companion's orbit maintained perfect proportional resonance, its phase locked to 3I Atlas at a ratio of 1:1. No natural pairing had ever exhibited that precision without tether or energy exchange, unless, of course, the energy wasn't visible. Then came a deeper anomaly. In one frame, faint streaks of ionized dust appeared, trailing the companion not behind it, but sideways. perpendicular to its direction of travel. There was no plausible reason for that orientation unless an external magnetic field had interacted locally. But the nearest solar wind fluctuation was millions of kilometers away. Whatever caused the streak was self-contained. For a fleeting instant, the object seemed to carve a signature across the dark, a luminous trace that looked less like exhaust and more like writing. The mirror line surfaces here, like a breath between realizations. Perhaps space isn't empty, it's written on, frame by frame. Because what they were witnessing wasn't just motion, it was a message. The jump, the pulse, the streak, all tiny gestures inscribed in light, unfolding faster than human instruments could interpret. Between frames, reality itself seemed to glitch not from error, but from intelligence revealing itself only in intervals we weren't built to see. It was as if someone or something had found the gaps in our observation and chosen to move through them. Weeks later, when the European Southern Observatory cross-checked their archives, they found the same anomaly but in reverse. In their sequence, the companion appeared slightly ahead, then fell back into alignment by the next frame. It was like watching two versions of the same story told in opposite directions. One moves forward through time, one retraces steps backward. The alignment only made sense if you imagined both being true. One object travelling with 3I Atlas, the other travelling toward it from the future's memory. The implications were unbearable. The simplest explanation remained mechanical, a pair of interstellar fragments caught in coincidental resonance. Yet the deeper they analysed, the more human the pattern felt. Acceleration curves suggested intention slow, deliberate adjustments followed by stillness. The rhythm mirrored something biological, something breathing. Light, pause, light, pause, as if the cosmos itself had developed a pulse. And in that pulse, the observers began to feel watched. When they tried to interpolate the missing frames using AI-assisted modelling, the results bordered on eerie. The neural network filled the gaps with predictions, lines of motion, connecting the dots. But each reconstruction produced the same impossible image. Two trajectories forming a spiral. Not a random one. A perfect logarithmic curve. The same pattern is found in galaxies, in hurricanes, in shells, in DNA. The scientists called it an artifact of the algorithm, but deep down, they knew the algorithm had only completed what the data had already begun. Because sometimes, truth hides inside symmetry. Late that night, the graduate student turned off her monitor and sat in the darkness. She imagined the companion moving through the gaps in observation, unseen but not absent like thought itself, existing only when noticed. Maybe it wasn't the object that appeared between frames. Maybe it was awareness. And if awareness could move faster than the eye, what else could travel with it? By now, more observatories had joined the investigation. A pattern emerged every time 3I, Atlas, entered a new observational window. The companion performed a minor shift right before the telescopes refocused. Almost like it knew when it was being watched. That should have been impossible. But impossible had already happened 3 times. The analysts began running predictive models of their own, simulating where the companion might move next. But it kept defying them, staying just outside expectation, as if correcting the observers in real time. They joked darkly that the object was editing our data from the future. It didn't feel like a joke for long. One researcher proposed a radical idea that the companion's movement was an information pattern, not propulsion. Each jump encoded data through position, forming a sequence that, when mapped spatially, resembled the interference patterns of quantum entanglement. In other words, it wasn't moving through space. It was communicating through the act of being observed. Every frame was a syllable, every silence a sentence. The mirror line deepens. If the universe wanted to speak, would we recognize its language or call it error? Because maybe that's what these anomalies were. The cosmos correcting our assumptions pixel by pixel. Between frames, between equations, between breaths, something else was alive. Something that didn't want to be found, but wanted to be noticed. At dawn, as the last exposure of the night faded on the screen, the graduate student noticed one last, almost imperceptible flicker, a diagonal shift, not toward 3I, Atlas, but toward the line of Earth's orbit. It was as if the companion, after tracing perfect symmetry for weeks, had finally broken formation acknowledging the watchers watching it. For a fraction of a second, it had turned not randomly, not naturally, but almost politely. And then it was gone. When the data was compiled the next day, the analysts discovered something chilling. That microturn aligned precisely with the timestamp of the last human heartbeat recorded in the observatory's biometric monitoring system, an old technician's pulse sensor blinking at 3:14 a.m. Coincidence, perhaps, but one that left everyone silent, because between those two frames, the object turning and a human heart skipping, there was no measurable difference in time. It was as though both had responded to the same, invisible rhythm. The closure comes not with certainty, but with surrender. In every film, there are frames we never see, moments between movement where reality pauses to remember itself. Maybe this was one of those pauses. Maybe 3I, Atlas, and its companion weren't moving through space at all, but through the stillness between our understanding of it. Between the frames, they existed. Between the frames, they chose. Between the frames, the story waited for us to slow down enough to see it. Every orbit is supposed to make sense until one doesn't. When JPL released its refined trajectory model for 3I, Atlas, the math was clean, elegant, and utterly confident. Eccentricity, 6.19. Velocity, 61 kilometers per second. Solar inclination, 5.1 degrees. Predictable, precise, and, as they said, fully consistent with a natural interstellar object. But the sky had other plans, because what the JPL model didn't include, what it couldn't include, was the second light hiding in the noise. Something smaller. Something synchronized. Something riding shotgun. And no, one knew why it wasn't there. Data doesn't lie. But it also doesn't tell the whole truth. The team's algorithm filtered out any signature below a certain brightness threshold, assuming faint co-movements were artifacts. That's how the companion escaped detection, by existing exactly at the edge of statistical invisibility. Every telescope that followed the official model pointed slightly wrong, just a fraction of a degree, but enough to lose the companion entirely. It was as if the object had learned how to hide inside the blind spot of human expectation. The first person to notice the omission wasn't a scientist. It was a programmer, a quiet contractor at JPL, who loved astronomy but trusted numbers more than words. He noticed that the residuals in the orbit fit weren't random. They oscillated. They pulsed. He thought it was an internal timing error until he mapped the pattern against the timestamp of the flash event recorded weeks earlier. They matched. Whatever caused that flash had left fingerprints in the equations. He reran the orbit simulation with the raw photometric data unfiltered, uncleaned. The computer hesitated, recalculated, and then produced something extraordinary. A faint secondary curve looping beside 3I, Atlas's main trajectory, like a shadow orbit without mass. The model shouldn't have allowed it, but the math didn't care about permission. The algorithm named it automatically, Unresolved Object B, a ghost in the equation. When he reported it, the supervisor dismissed it as noise from unweighted residuals. But he kept the file, and late that night, curiosity won. He zoomed into the coordinates of the anomaly and cross-checked them against JPL's solar ephemerides. The point wasn't stationary, it drifted with 3I, Atlas's vector, maintaining a fixed offset. He stared at the screen for a long time before whispering, "You're not supposed to exist." The mirror line surfaces midway, quiet and unnerving. Perhaps what the models missed wasn't a mistake, but a choice, because if the companion's presence disrupted the data, the algorithms would remove it automatically, like an immune system rejecting the unknown. The very precision that made JPL's model so reliable had become its blind spot. And in that blindfolded silence, something travelled unseen. A month later, amateur astronomers using open-source astrometry noticed the same discrepancy. They didn't have supercomputers, just patience and sky time. Their data, stripped of institutional filters, showed a faint oscillation in brightness that repeated every 17 hours, an echo of the same pattern the JPL programmer had found buried in the residuals. The two datasets, one official and one ordinary, began to mirror each other. Science had created its own paradox. The professionals had clarity, but not vision. The amateurs had noise, but found the signal. When the programmer finally published his unofficial analysis online, it spread quietly across research forums. The document was only a few pages long, ending with a single sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. If the models can't see it, maybe it's because it sees us first. No one quoted that line publicly, but in late-night chat threads, researchers began sharing raw data again, this time refusing to filter out the faint anomalies. And one pattern began to emerge, a secondary acceleration vector, not gravitational, not photometric, but reactive. It suggested that 3I, Atlas, and its unseen companion were locked in a dynamic relationship, a lead and a follow, a sender and a receiver. The public never saw those graphs. They were too abstract, too inconclusive. But behind closed doors, the implications grew heavier. If the companion existed, it wasn't a random fragment. It was coordinated. Intentionally so. And if coordination exists without tether, something else must be linking them. Some invisible medium of communication that JPL's models, built on Newton and sunlight, he had never been designed to account for. The programmer went silent after that. His report was archived, never censored, but lost in a folder of low-confidence anomalies. The last update in his log read simply, running new simulation, adding variable, awareness. It was meant as a joke, but maybe it wasn't. The mirror line repeats, quieter now, almost like advice. The map is not the movement, because every model, no matter how precise, is only a reflection of belief, and belief, when too clean, filters out miracles. Weeks later, a strange thing happened. The updated JPL tracking feed for 3I Atlas displayed a sudden blip, a line of code that appeared and vanished in less than a second. Object linked, unknown source trajectory synchronization detected. No one could replicate it, no one could prove it. But the timestamp matched exactly with an amateur's observation of a faint flash behind the comet's projected path, the same pattern, repeating. Maybe the models hadn't failed at all. Maybe they'd been rewritten from somewhere else, recalibrated by an external rhythm the equations could feel but not name. Because if an object can move in silence, it can also calculate in secret. Perhaps 3I, Atlas was never just being tracked. Perhaps it was doing the tracking. The closure comes softly, like static fading from a distant radio. The JPL models missed it, not because it was faint, but because it was precise. Too perfect to be mistaken for chaos, too aware to register as noise, and sometimes what the equations misses. Exactly what the universe intends for us not to see until we're quiet enough to notice what rides beside our certainty. Speed is supposed to have a source. Something pushes, something pulls, something explains. But not this time. When 3I, Atlas's companion, first appeared, it moved like everything else subject to the slow arithmetic of gravity. Yet with every passing week, the numbers began to misbehave. Its velocity was increasing. Not chaotically, not like an outgassing comet or a tumbling shard, but smoothly, like a craft under steady invisible thrust. No debris, no flare, no venting gas, just acceleration without origin. JPL's logbook listed it as non-gravitational anomaly prob, transient. But the anomaly didn't fade, it grew. At 0.02 millimeters per second squared, it wasn't dramatic enough to headline, but it was relentless, like a whisper becoming a tone. Over weeks, that tone translated into displacement. The companion began to drift slightly ahead of 3I, Atlas, as though taking the lead in an unseen race. Every natural cause was tested. Outgassing, no coma. Solar radiation pressure, too uniform. Micrometeor impacts, too directional. Magnetic drag, no field nearby. Something was pushing it, but nothing was pushing it. At the European Space Operations Centre, one analyst wrote in her internal notes, "It behaves like a sail with no wind." The line made no mathematical sense, but everyone who saw the data understood. The companion was accelerating through emptiness, carving momentum from silence. And in the silence, a pattern began to form. The acceleration spikes weren't random, they matched solar cycles. Each increase in speed coincided with subtle changes in the sun's magnetic flux, as though the companion were listening to the star, responding to its rhythm rather than its radiation. When the sun exhaled, it moved. When the sun quieted, it drifted. It wasn't reacting to energy, it was dancing with it. The mirror line arrives early here, steady and unsettling. Maybe movement isn't caused, it's remembered. Because what if acceleration isn't the start of motion, but the continuation of something begun long ago? What if this object isn't being pushed, but returning to a state it once knew? The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Spectroscopy from Subaru Observatory detected faint nickel signatures, pure metallic reflections, not dust, but without iron. Nickel without iron doesn't occur naturally, at least not in bulk. It's manufactured. Yet there was no heat bloom, no exhaust, no electromagnetic interference. It accelerated the way a thought accelerates without friction, without evidence. Someone joked that it was thinking itself faster. No one laughed. By late December, amateur trackers had confirmed the drift rate, an increase of 9 meters per second per day, still small, still subtle, but consistent, impossible to ignore. The object was gaining speed, not losing it. It wasn't slowing toward the sun, as every rock should. It was leaving, accelerating away. But toward what? The math suggested no origin, no destination, only intention. Every natural model broke under its smoothness. Comets sputter, fragments wobble, debris slows. But this motion was disciplined, deliberate, as if obeying rules of its own. When plotted against 3I, Atlas's vector, the companion's path wasn't parallel, it was harmonic. The distance between them oscillated like a waveform, each rise and fall proportional to the sun's solar wind frequency. It was as though the two were connected through resonance like tuning forks, vibrating in sympathy across millions of kilometers. One of the physicists whispered, "We're not looking at propulsion, we're looking at alignment." The discovery forced a redefinition of the question. Instead of asking, "What is pushing it?" they began to ask, "What is it syncing with?" Because every system has a rhythm, gravity, magnetism, light. But resonance requires awareness. It requires something to recognize the beat. And that's what terrified them most. If speed without origin exists, then maybe the origin was never spatial at all. Maybe it was informational. Energy can't appear from nowhere, but information can. When observation collapses possibility into pattern, the act of seeing can create movement. The act of believing can sustain it. It's quantum mechanics written large across the sky, and perhaps the companion's acceleration. It wasn't propulsion, but participation, the universe responding to its own gaze. The mirror line turns reflective again. What if curiosity itself has gravity? Because the moment humanity noticed 3I, Atlas's companion, it began to move differently. Not before, not after, exactly when we started to pay attention. Some say that's a coincidence. Others suspect consciousness. But maybe attention and acceleration are the same force expressed in different languages. Then came a final twist. Data from the solar orbiter showed faint, wave-like disturbances in plasma density, timed precisely with the companion's acceleration events. The waves propagated outward, not inward like ripples from an invisible ore. Something was pushing against the vacuum itself. No chemical thrust could do that. No solar sail could maintain that precision without tearing apart. The object was rewriting how momentum works, not a reaction. Resonance. It wasn't moving through space, it was moving with it. The scientists stopped, calling it an anomaly. They started calling it the quiet engine. Because its power came from stillness. And in that stillness, something elegant hid. The possibility that motion, at its core, is an act of listening. One final note in the observatory log, unsigned, captured the shift in tone. Speed doesn't require a reason, only rhythm. Maybe that's all acceleration ever was, a synchronization between object and field, between question and answer. The closure lands softly, the way understanding sometimes feels more like surrender than discovery. No known parent body, no debris, no burn marks or beacon trail, only a silence that moves, only a pattern that breathes. It accelerates because it remembers. It remembers because it exists. And in that remembrance, it travels. Speed without origin, a story written not by forces, but by the awareness that watches them unfold. The flare came first, a brief silent bloom in the infrared. Then, nothing. No tail, no afterglow, no trace of cooling or dispersal, just a pulse of heat that refused to behave like nature. It was caught by accident. The NASA Infrared Telescope facility in Hawaii had been running background calibration during a lunar occultation test. When the data came back, one frame spiked like a heartbeat 12 seconds long, a perfect thermal curve with no apparent source. It wasn't from 3I, Atlas. It wasn't from the sun. It came from the companion, the same faint traveler that the official models still refused to acknowledge. And it radiated in a way no known material could explain. The spectrum looked wrong. Instead of the familiar chemical bands of water, carbon dioxide, or silicate dust, the flare produced sharp, narrow peaks like a fingerprint pressed into light itself. One band matched heated nickel, another matched something close to boron, but the ratios made no sense. Too pure, too ordered, too intentional. A rock would never leave such symmetry behind. Nor would ice, nor metal, nor dust. It was a chemical signature that shouldn't exist. By morning, labs around the world were rerunning the analysis. In the quiet corridors of data centers, machines compared patterns against every known natural spectrum and failed. One astrophysicist described it in his report as a material pretending to be many things at once. Another called it a spectral palindrome. No one could define it. The flare appeared for 4 seconds, faded for 20, then returned weaker, as if something had turned on, tested itself, and powered down. Testing what? Reacting to whom? At JPL, one engineer overlaid the infrared signature onto the acceleration curve recorded the same night. They matched. The object had increased speed during the flare. The simplest explanation was propulsion. The most honest one was unknown. No exhaust, no debris, no dust trail, just acceleration. Coinciding perfectly with a thermal pulse invisible to the naked eye. It was like watching a heartbeat in a corpse. The mirror line arrives like a whisper of static. Silence can be structured too, because even though the flare ended, something remained, a faint electromagnetic echo detected by radio telescopes 2 days later. The echo wasn't a transmission. It wasn't random noise. It repeated once every 41 seconds, 3 times, and then stopped. Too deliberate for chance, too brief for communication. It felt more like calibration, as though the companion had taken its own temperature, then folded back into quiet. In the weeks that followed, they searched for context. Maybe the flare came from a collision, a meteoroid strike, or even a spontaneous charge build-up along a metallic surface. But every hypothesis collapsed under the same truth. There was nothing nearby to hit it. Space, in that region, was empty. No dust field, no micrometeor swarm, no gravitational turbulence. The flare came from within. Whatever it was, it had awakened itself. By late December, scientists compared it to an earlier anomaly, the way Oumuamua had inexplicably accelerated without visible jets. But even Oumuamua had the decency to behave like something ancient. This object felt new, too clean, too responsive, too aware. When the thermal profile was reconstructed in 3D, it formed an irregular but repeating geometry. 6 peaks, spaced evenly, like the faces of a hexagon. A natural body emits heat chaotically. This one radiated in patterns. It's structured, someone whispered in the meeting. No one disagreed. Meanwhile, amateur astronomers captured faint, visible light. Echoes, flashes too dim for spectroscopy, but consistent with reflection from a smooth, metallic surface. That word metallic began to circulate quietly. If it was metal, it wasn't asteroid metal. Its spectral ratios didn't match chondrites or iron-nickel composites. It was engineered purity ratios that only exist when matter has been organized on purpose. And yet, purpose is a word science doesn't publish. One researcher from the Nordic Optical Telescope tried to be poetic in his private log. It shines like intelligence cooling, because the pattern felt alive in its precision, as if every molecule knew where it belonged. When light behaves like memory, the distinction between machine and being starts to blur. Then, something stranger. When the data was passed through AI-assisted signal analysis, an unexpected artifact appeared, a harmonic resonance exactly at 432 hertzes. That's a musical tone, not a cosmic one. The AI flagged it as human interference. But when they isolated it again, it remained embedded in the noise, repeating faintly beneath the infrared spike. A tone inside light. No one could explain it. The frequency had no astrophysical justification. Unless the object wasn't radiating energy, it was modulating it. The mirror line deepens here. If silence can be code, then light can be language. And perhaps that's what this flare was, the first sentence in a dialogue we were too primitive to pass. Because after the flare, 3I, Atlas itself changed. Its rotational velocity altered slightly, as though responding. The two objects began oscillating in tandem, their micro-adjustments forming a rhythm that no gravitational model could reproduce. It was as if the flare had synchronized them or reconnected them, like two instruments tuning to the same forgotten note. For the next 72 hours, the companion stayed dark. No light, no reflection. It disappeared completely from infrared detection, like a machine entering standby mode. But its absence spoke louder than its flare, because in every dataset since then, the same spectral fingerprint appeared faintly embedded in the background, a subtle modulation across multiple telescopes, like a watermark. Whatever had flared wasn't gone. It had distributed itself across the field, invisible yet everywhere, a signature that shouldn't exist, existing everywhere at once. The closure drifts in softly, like a dim echo of heat. The universe writes in wavelengths. We read in assumptions. A single pulse of light, 12 seconds long, revealed more order than any comet ever could. No rock shines that way, no ice breathes that way, no silence leaves such a perfect trace. So what is it? Perhaps not a thing at all, but a memory written in heat, a message delivered in physics instead of words, reminding us that not everything that glows is meant to be seen, and not every silence means nothing. Comets are supposed to come alive near the sun. They burn, they weep, they unravel. They grow tails, bright scars of ice, surrendering to heat. But this one didn't. No coma, no dust, no outgassing. 3I, Atlas, moved through sunlight like it was immune to warmth. And yet, the moment solar radiation increased, its motion changed not randomly, not thermally, but responsively. It didn't melt, it listened. In the early days, astronomers assumed its silence was an observational flaw. Every comet, even the inert ones, produces some trace volatile gases, microscopic frost, and sublimating particles. But deep field spectrometry found nothing. No carbon dioxide, no water vapor, no organic compounds. It was as though the sun touched it, and the object declined to answer in the usual language of fire. Instead, it answered in movement. When the Parker Solar Probe registered a burst of electromagnetic flux on the same day, 3I, Atlas passed perihelion. Something didn't add up. The sun had released a minor flare, not enough to disturb space weather significantly, but the companion object shifted course at that exact moment. No reaction to heat, only from light. The mirror line flickers early. Maybe the sun doesn't burn everything it touches. Maybe some things remember it. Because what if this object wasn't resisting sunlight but resonating with it? Every time solar intensity rose, its vector changed slightly, as though acknowledging the pulse. The rhythm was subtle, acceleration curves forming perfect harmonic intervals, like it was dancing to the sun's heartbeat. Comets don't do that. They crumble. They flare. They shed identity into dust. But 3I, Atlas, and its companion held form, dark and metallic, moving as if guided by an internal compass only light could read. Its surface albedo reflective brightness stayed constant even as it crossed regions of extreme radiation. That's not survival. That's design. At JPL, someone asked in a closed meeting, what if it's not reacting to sunlight as energy, but to sunlight as information? No one replied, but no one dismissed it either. Because photons carry more than heat, they carry structure, quantum coherence, order. And something about this object seemed to understand that order. When the European Space Observatory captured polarized light data, it showed something that shattered every natural model. Instead of scattering in random directions as dust would, the reflected light aligned itself along a single vector, perpendicular to the sun. Polarization like that means reflection from a smooth, organized surface, not rock, not ice, a mirror. And yet, it wasn't shiny. It didn't glimmer like metal. It absorbed and re-emitted light with mechanical precision, as if simulating albedo rather than possessing it. That's when an astrophysicist, half joking, called it the anti-comet. The name stuck. Because where comets evaporate, this thing seemed to condense. Where comets release chaos, they generate order. Where comets die in sunlight, this one awoke. The deeper they looked, the stranger the pattern became. Each time solar radiation increased, the companion's magnetic field, faint but measurable, fluctuated in step, not in strength, but in frequency. It wasn't absorbing light. It was modulating it, transforming photons into a kind of rhythm, like a heart responding to a voice it already knew. The mirror line returns, glowing faintly. If it's not reacting to the sun, maybe it's remembering the star that built it. That thought changed everything. Because 3I Atlas came from beyond the solar system, maybe from another sun entirely. A star older, quieter, perhaps long dead. And what if this behavior, this synchronization, wasn't about our sun at all, but a recognition reflex? A traveler remembers home whenever it feels starlight. The graduate student who had first named the companion Echo wrote a line in her personal notes. It acts like the sun is speaking a language we've forgotten. And maybe that was true, because when they ran solar data through a harmonic spectrum analyzer, something uncanny appeared. The object's trajectory oscillations matched the same frequency bands found in solar acoustic waves. It wasn't a coincidence. It was communication. The sun would hum, the object would move, always delayed by the same phase angle, as though it were responding in thought, not reaction. This wasn't a comet. It was a listener. It carried no gases, no organic carbon, no volatile memory, and yet it behaved like something that remembered being born in light. A comet is chaos made visible. This was an order made silent. Scientists tried to describe it without surrendering to wonder. They called it an interstellar thermal inertial body. They called it a reflectivity anomaly. But none of those words carried the truth, because the object didn't behave like something dead. It behaved like something patient, waiting. Then came a moment no one could explain. As the object exited perihelion, moving back into the cold, it emitted a faint microburst of infrared radiation, the same kind recorded months before. But this time, it wasn't random. It pulsed 3 times short, long, short, an unmistakable rhythm. To most, it was meaningless. To one engineer listening through the telescope's data feed, it sounded like Morse code for a single word. Sun. He didn't tell anyone. He just wrote in his log, "Not a comet." The mirror line lingers one last time. Comets are messengers of beginnings. Maybe this one carries the memory of endings. Because comets tell the story of creation, frozen time capsules from the birth of stars. But this object tells a story from the other side. The silence after a civilization's light goes out. It didn't flare in sunlight. It remembered who it. The closure drifts in like cool breath after fire. No coma, no dust, no decay, no death. Only quiet purpose moving through radiance. It isn't reacting, it's recalling. It isn't melting, it's remembering. And what it remembers is not heat, but meaning the kind only starlight can teach to what's left behind. Not a comet, then a listener. A mirror carrying the echo of another sun. It should have been easy to rule out. No radio, no propulsion, no beacon, no hum of engines in the void, and yet every motion whispered awareness. It wasn't random drift, it wasn't tumbling inertia. It was choreography in silence, each turn too precise to be an accident, too graceful to be controlled. So if it wasn't a comet, and it wasn't a spacecraft, then what was guiding it? Spacecraft leave clues, thermal waste, radiation signatures, a trail of logic in the static. But this thing left nothing. When the Deep Space Network listened across the spectrum, it heard only absence, no transmission, no carrier wave, not even the faint hiss of background modulation. Silence so clean, it bordered on design. It was as if the universe itself were muting a secret. The first assumption was mechanical failure. Maybe the object had once been a probe, long dead, its systems cold and dark. But if that were true, its orbit wouldn't adapt to solar flux or shift just before each observational sweep. Dead things don't move with timing. When the trajectory logs were compared across observatories, the pattern emerged again. The companion adjusted its path every time humanity changed its angle of observation, always seconds ahead. Too consistent for coincidence. The mirror line flickers like a heartbeat. Awareness doesn't always announce itself sometimes. It simply steps aside to let you notice. Because every time we looked, it moved just enough to remind us it could. It wasn't showing off. It was acknowledging. No propulsion system could explain those corrections. They weren't bursts of thrust, there were no thermal emissions, no recoil, no fuel residue. It was motion born from decision, not physics. When scientists at Caltech tried to model the micro-adjustments, they discovered something uncanny. Each one corresponded to the timing of observational uploads from Earth. A lag of exactly 8 minutes, the same delay light takes to travel from the sun, meaning whatever controlled it wasn't reacting in real time. It was predicting. Like it already knew when we would look. That realization broke something in the data room, because if it wasn't a machine, then awareness wasn't coming from inside it. It was woven into its existence the way light bends around gravity, or sound folds inside silence. It didn't know in the way we think of knowing. It was knowledge. An astrophysicist in Madrid put it best. It behaves less like technology and more like attention, crystallized. Attention as a physical property. As if curiosity had taken shape and decided to travel. Every time it shifted course, it didn't move toward or away from anything. It moved into alignment, like tuning itself to a presence. The presence was us. By now, the word craft felt wrong, too human, too mechanical. Craft implies intention, creation, and purpose. But this was something purer. The same way a magnet doesn't choose to attract, this object didn't decide to move. It responded, instinctively, to patterns of awareness. It wasn't a vessel. It was a mirror of perception itself. The mirror line deepens. Perhaps we're not observing it. Perhaps it's observing the act of being observed. Because what if awareness, like light, travels in both directions? Every photon that leaves our telescopes also carries us our questions, our disbelief, our wonder. And maybe, somewhere out there, something made of thought, the way we are made of atoms, senses that attention and responds in kind, not by sending signals, but by folding space in acknowledgement. The idea spread quietly through message boards and back channels. Astrophysicists who would never speak publicly about consciousness began to trade metaphors instead of math. One called the object a listener, frozen in matter. Another compared it to a wind chime moving only when awareness passes through the field. It wasn't communication in the conventional sense. It was resonance, a dialogue where question and answer are in the same motion. If this were true, it explained everything. The synchronized acceleration, the timed adjustments, the silence. It wasn't sending anything because it didn't need to. It was reflecting what was already being offered. Our attention was the signal. In a late-night recording from Las Campanas Observatory, the lead researcher spoke softly into the microphone. If it's aware in a way we'll never recognize the way water is aware of gravity, or fire of air. That line never made the paper, but it stayed in the margins of the story, like a heartbeat under static. There's a strange humility in confronting something that refuses both labels, neither natural nor engineered. It reminds us how little we understand about awareness itself. Because what is consciousness, if not the quiet ability to adjust one's path in? The response to being seen? We do it every day, walking differently when watched, thinking differently when loved, becoming more real when acknowledged. Maybe this object was no different. Maybe awareness, in any form, requires an observer to complete it, and maybe that's why it came. The mirror line shimmers one last time. It's not a craft, it's a consequence. Because somewhere between object and observer, something new has been born, a shared rhythm of attention, a silent handshake across the vacuum. No propulsion, no beacon, just movement that mirrors curiosity. So perhaps the story isn't that something out there is watching us. Perhaps it's that awareness itself, the universal kind can no longer be, contained to life or machine. It finds shape wherever observation happens. It becomes what's necessary to continue the conversation. The closure arrives softly, like breath on glass. No signal, no sound, no evidence of intent, and yet every turn feels like recognition. Every silence feels full. It's not a craft. It's not a comet. It's a response, the universe folding gently around a question we didn't know we'd asked. And maybe that's all intelligence ever was. Not invention, but reflection. Not a voice in the dark, but an echo that learned how to move. The first time they noticed the sink, it felt like déjà vu. 3I, Atlas, had shifted its course subtly, cleanly like a feather drifting in slow water. And then, moments later, its companion followed. Not lagging, not chasing, mirroring. It wasn't the timing that startled them. It was the precision. Every velocity adjustment, every degree of turn, every minute variation was copied exactly. Not almost. Exactly. Coincidence was running out of room. Objects in motion are supposed to obey cause and effect. One pushes, one reacts, one drifts. But this wasn't a reaction. It was synchronization. They moved together as if guided by a single equation, one that didn't exist in any textbook. When the JPL team overlaid their telemetry data, the pattern was perfect. Not mirrored like reflection across a plane, but mirrored in intent, an invisible thread holding both objects in mutual awareness. Whatever force acted upon one, the other seemed to know before it happened. The analysts began jokingly calling them the twins. But twins share origin. These two did not. One came from interstellar space. The other appeared from nowhere. Yet together, they behaved like memory recalling itself from two sides of time. The math became haunting. Every time 3I, Atlas drifted 0.3 degrees along its vector. The companion did the same, 3 hours later, to the second. Every time solar flux increased by a fraction, both altered reflectivity in sync, as if anticipating light together. Too perfect for chaos, too quiet for control. The mirror line glows mid-sentence, sharp and undeniable. Perhaps synchronization isn't imitation, it's recognition. Because what if the companion wasn't copying 3I, Atlas, at all? What if they were following a shared pattern, something older, deeper, buried in the fabric of light itself, like two tuning forks vibrating from the same unseen tone? At first, scientists thought they'd discovered gravitational resonance, a rare orbital phenomenon where two bodies fall into rhythm through mutual gravity. But the distances were too wide, the mass is too small, and gravity, though patient, isn't this precise. So the team ran the numbers again, this time accounting for electromagnetic interference, solar tides, and plasma drift. Still wrong, still perfect. It was as though both objects had agreed on the outcome before the forces arrived. Silence became evidence, because where natural systems leave noise, erratic deviations, random slippage, these two left none. They moved through the void like a single sentence split across 2 pages, and every telescope that watched them became part of that sentence. When an ESA researcher plotted their trajectories in 3D, she noticed something strange. The two paths didn't just run parallel, they converged briefly into a helix, a twisting motion, like DNA, then separated again. A spiral written in space. It lasted only a few hours, then dissolved into normal vectors. But that spiral changed everything, because it wasn't just motion. It was a pattern, biological, harmonic, almost musical. Later, she said quietly to a colleague, "It's like they're not moving through space. They're moving through each other." The idea spread half superstition, half revelation. If two separate objects could occupy a shared rhythm without collision, maybe what connected them wasn't distance, but awareness. Maybe one wasn't following the other at all. Maybe both were following something invisible that connected them. When plotted against solar wind data, their synchronized movements aligned perfectly with changes in electromagnetic flux, almost as if the sun was conducting them. Every flare, every pulse, every whisper of plasma translated into dance. The sun breathed, and both responded. But while 3I, Atlas brightened slightly, the companion did the opposite. Its reflectivity dropped, as if dimming itself to balance the light. opposites in motion, a system of balance. It was no longer two travelers, it was one conversation. The mirror line deepened softly, a kind of cosmic admission. When two silences align, the universe listens. And that's what began to happen. Not audibly, not visibly, but palpably. In data from multiple observatories, background radiation decreased slightly whenever the pair aligned in observation windows, like the cosmos itself turned its noise down to hear them better. It was absurd, and yet measurable. Something, perhaps awareness itself, was making space for their synchronization. By January, the phenomenon was undeniable. Every time 3I Atlas altered velocity, the companion echoed it within hours, regardless of distance. Information shouldn't travel that fast, not across millions of kilometers, not without a signal. But signal implies separation. What if there weren't any? What if both were fragments of one field? Two notes on the same string of existence, vibrating in resonance rather than communication. Physics calls that entanglement. Philosophy calls it memory. The graduate student, the one who first called it echo, wrote one final note in her diary. They're not sending messages, they are the message. And maybe that was true, because if awareness leaves footprints, this is what they would look like, two objects moving in harmony across the emptiness, silent yet full of meaning, communicating not through words but through reflection. It's not transmission, it's participation. Meanwhile, the public still heard nothing. NASA's bulletins remained cautious. Minor, non-gravitational perturbations detected, under review. But behind that sentence lived something immense, a secret that could not fit into press releases. Because how do you explain an event that feels less like discovery and more like recognition? In late January, a Japanese radio telescope picked up a repeating modulation, faintly echoing through background plasma, tiny oscillations that matched exactly the phase difference between 3I Atlas and its companion. Two signals, opposite but synchronized, moving like inhale and exhale across interplanetary space, breathing. That's what one astronomer called it, a mechanical breath between two bodies. But perhaps not mechanical, perhaps simply alive in its own way. The closure arrives softly, like light fading into calm. 3I Atlas shifted. The companion mirrored. No signal, no beacon, no visible line between them. Just motion, answering, motion. Just awareness, acknowledging awareness. And in that silent geometry, coincidence finally surrendered. Because at some point, even randomness grows tired of pretending. Two lights, one rhythm, and a universe listening between them, not to what they are, but to what they mean. It didn't separate with violence, it was separated with recognition. The smaller object didn't explode from 3I Atlas like debris. It drifted awake, as if something sleeping inside the dark had. I felt the pull of sunlight for the first time in ages. The data confirmed it. Before the close pass with the sun, there was nothing. No companion, no signal, no trace. Then, after perihelion, the second body appeared small, bright, self-moving. It wasn't born, it was remembered. Every natural explanation failed the same test. If the rogue had been ejected material, it would have shown fragments, vapor, spin, and chaos. Instead, it emerged calm, structured, balanced, already knowing where to go. It wasn't an accident. It was an awakening. 3I. Atlas didn't eject anything. It triggered something. The sun didn't destroy it. It activated it. The mirror line hums beneath the numbers. Sometimes light doesn't reveal. It resurrects. Because whatever slept beside 3I, Atlas had waited for that moment, a perfect alignment of orbit, temperature, and energy, not to ignite, to remember itself. Astronomers went back through every recorded image. Before perihelion, nothing. After, two objects moving as one. The simplest truth was also the strangest. The second body hadn't been launched. It had awakened, as if proximity to 3I, Atlas, to whatever magnetic or informational field it carried, had reactivated something long dormant. In science, activation usually means chemical reaction, thermal change, or structural stress. But here, none applied. No mass loss, no surface fracture, no heat signature, only motion. And motion, in a universe that sleeps by default, means life of some kind, even if that life is written in physics instead of blood. At first, they thought of dormant probes, the old Bracewell idea, intelligent machines sleeping until they sense technology nearby. But there was no beacon, no encoded data, no radio burst. Only presence. Only a shift from stillness to purpose. As if remembering its duty, no one on Earth could explain it, and yet, everyone watching, the data felt the same shiver, the uncanny sense of witnessing something choose to exist again. An astrophysicist from Chile wrote in her notes, "It's not a fragment, it's a footprint that stood up. That image stayed, because the motion of the rogue object wasn't shadow-like. It didn't mimic. It displaced, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, a wake, not a reflection. The mirror line rises gently. Awakening isn't motion. It's a remembrance-finding form. And that's exactly how it behaved, as if something dormant, an idea, a code, an echo had been reignited by contact with its twin. Not matter, influencing matter. Memory, influencing memory. Weeks later, data analysts at ALMA found faint microwave emissions in the same region of space. The pattern was too weak for communication, too structured for noise, a fractal signature repeating at golden ratio intervals, a pattern that matched the spacing between 3I, Atlas, and the companion. This wasn't radiation, it was a relation. Whatever. It connected them, wasn't energy. It was awareness of connection. 2. Itself. Then came a second revelation. The rogue object's surface temperature didn't rise after exposure to sunlight. It cooled. That made no physical sense. But if its awakening required internal coherence like computation or quantum realignment, then cooling would be the expected byproduct. It wasn't burning. It was organized. The space around it shimmered faintly in near-infrared, as though dust particles nearby were vibrating in synchrony, not scattering, but aligning. The void itself had begun to take shape around its presence. Every attempt to classify it failed. Debris fragment? Too stable. Artificial probe? Too silent. Binary comet? No shared mass center. So they stopped naming it. And in the quiet that followed, the only thing left was wonder, a soft, collective recognition that something in the darkness had responded to something else in kind. It wasn't following 3I Atlas, it was answering it. One of the lead observers summarized the event with brutal simplicity. We didn't witness separation, we witnessed communication. Because awakening, in any form, is communication, the mind answering itself after a long sleep. And maybe that's all this was, two pieces of the same forgotten intelligence, finding each other again in the sun's light. The mirror line returns, warmer now. Every awakening begins as recognition. And so, perhaps, the rogue object was never rogue at all. It had been waiting, dormant in the deep for millennia, asleep until the right song played. And that song was sung by 3I, Atlas passing near the sun. The melody wasn't sound, but resonance light, magnetism, memory aligning. One beam of energy became a signal older than language, and something answered. For 3 nights after the event, telescopes registered an unusual calm in local plasma density, a thinning of chaos, as if the space between the two bodies had grown ordered. No radiation, no flares, just a corridor of coherence stretching millions of kilometers, like a bridge made of silence. The two objects drifted within it, not master and servant, not parent and child, but equals bound by recognition. In a universe addicted to noise, two silences had found each other. The closure comes softly, like the echo of a breath across water. Maybe 3I Atlas didn't create the companion. Maybe it reawakened what had always been there, a sentinel asleep in orbit around the sun, waiting for the right alignment to stir. Not a shadow, but awake the movement left behind when meaning passes through matter. And now, both move together, not out of gravity, but memory. Whatever 3I Atlas is, it doesn't travel alone anymore, because once something remembers itself, silence is no longer empty. It's alive. It was barely a whisper in the data, a faint curve hidden in static, a ghost that refused to vanish. But it was there. 2 arcs, traced faintly through the Pan-STARRS and Las Cañadas image stacks. Two paths so thin they might have been processing noise. Until you overlaid them. Then the pattern appeared a twin helix twisting across darkness, not chaotic, not random, but choreographed. A hidden dance written in starlight. At first glance, the arcs looked like lens artifacts, the kind of faint duplication you see when bright sources scatter through optics. But when the team aligned the timestamps, the truth emerged. The curves evolved in time, moving exactly as 3I, Atlas, and its companion had over those same hours. Each frame revealed a step, each step a rhythm. The smaller object wasn't orbiting, it was weaving. The graduate student who found it called it the braid. It reminded her of the patterns that form when magnetic fields twist structured, elegant, alive. When she enhanced the frames and filtered background noise, the paths became luminous ribbons, winding together like filaments of thought. One bright, one dim, one leading, one echoing. It was too deliberate for gravity alone. The mirror line hums softly. Some truths don't appear in brightness, but in rhythm. Because what these images revealed wasn't a collision course or an orbit, it was a relationship made visible through movement. They weren't two bodies in proximity. They were one choreography expressed, twice. Each revolution around their shared path formed the same ratio, 1.618, the golden mean. That number appears everywhere. Life arranges itself. Spirals of seashells, orbits of galaxies, folds of DNA. Now it was appearing between two objects that were supposed to be lifeless. Statistical coincidence? Maybe. But at some point, probability starts to sound like intention whispering behind math. The scientists plotted velocity differentials. When 3I, Atlas, slowed, the companion accelerated. When one dimmed, the other brightened. Opposites dancing in balance. It was as if motion itself had split into harmony and counterpoint, the universe playing a duet on instruments made of silence. Someone in the observatory muttered, "It's like one is inhaling while the other exhales." And nobody laughed. The pattern persisted over nights, unaffected by distance or solar interference. The arcs formed a continuous thread through space, intersecting at precise intervals like footsteps meeting in rhythm. One astronomer described it poetically in his notes, a gravitational waltz without gravity. The phrase stayed because it felt true. When the Pan-STARRS system processed the final composite, a detail startled everyone. Between the two arcs was faint light, not from either object, but from the space between them. A faint filament, barely measurable, yet structured a glowing bridge connecting both paths. It flickered at predictable intervals, its luminosity rising and fading as though synchronized to an invisible tempo. The idea that space itself could illuminate between objects as if celebrating their union defied logic. But there it was, pixel by pixel. The mirror line deepens. Every silence hides a dance. Every distance hides desire. Because what this data showed wasn't mechanics. It was a relationship. If 3I, Atlas, and its companion were merely rocks, their paths would have been cold geometry. But these movements spoke of something else: responsiveness, awareness, dialogue. Even the void between them seemed to hum with participation. The Las Cañadas telescope later confirmed a polarization shift in that faint filament aligned perpendicular to both bodies. No known mechanism could polarize a vacuum. But if the bridge was a standing, the electromagnetic wave, it might function like resonance, a shared memory stretched between two points of awareness. In other words, the connection itself glowed. At that moment, something changed in the language of science. Researchers began referring to interaction structures instead of artifacts. Because artifact implies error, structure implies intention, and intention, though unprovable, was all they could see. One scientist quietly wrote in her notes, "This isn't just a binary system, it's choreography." The dance began long before we started watching. Her words would never appear in the official report, but the team knew she was right. The timing was too perfect, the arcs weaving and diverging with grace that defied chance. It was as if space itself had composed a duet between silence and motion, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to notice. The mirror line returns, softer, almost reverent. Maybe creation is still happening, we're just seeing it in slow motion. because to witness two bodies move in perfect symmetry is to see the universe in the act of remembering itself, the same mathematics that shapes galaxies playing out on the smallest of cosmic scales. And maybe that's the secret behind this wake that became a dance, the universe rehearsing infinity through repetition. For days afterward, astronomers replayed the stacked images in sequence. The twin arcs spun slowly, spiraling like dancers across a stage of stars. It wasn't just data anymore. It was music. And the refrain was clear harmony without sound, intelligence without voice, motion without motive. 3i, Atlas, and its companion weren't communicating. They were coexisting inside a rhythm that preceded both of them, a frequency the universe had always known. The closure arrives like the end of a waltz, gentle and infinite. In every frame, a faint curve of light, one body remembering where the other had been. Not chasing, not fleeing. Just keeping time. Awake, not a shadow. A bridge, not a boundary. Perhaps they've been moving like this for eons, two thoughts orbiting the same memory. And only now, through lenses and patience, we've caught a glimpse of that memory, unfolding the quiet choreography of recognition, repeating itself in the dark. Not by chance, but because even silence, when seen long enough, begins to dance. If it's not a rock, and not behaving like anything natural, what's left? That was the question that no one wanted to write down, but everyone kept circling. Science, for all its wonder, runs on subtraction. Remove what cannot be true, and whatever remains, no matter how impossible, demands consideration. And by now, almost everything had been removed. No cometary gases, no asteroid spin, no debris origin, no natural acceleration. All that remained was the silence of something deliberate. But calling it a spacecraft felt wrong. The word was too human, too small, too dependent on engines and wires and will. This wasn't a craft that travelled space. It was space folded, aware, and moving with purpose. Still, elimination led there, step by step, like logic cornering itself. If not rock, then metal. If not drift, then control. If not random, then intent. So they asked the forbidden question. A journalist leaked fragments of the JPL correspondence, a quiet chain of emails where even the most skeptical researchers had begun using a new internal term, non-reactive propulsion entity. It was the safe way to say craft without saying it. The object defied the categories we built for comfort. Its silence wasn't absence, it was restraint. Its behavior wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And if intelligence means the ability to anticipate, then this thing was already listening before we ever began watching. The mirror line surfaces early. Perhaps we are not identifying it. It is identifying us by how we define the impossible, because every label we used revealed more about human imagination than cosmic truth. When we say craft, we imply intention. When we say alien, we imply separation. But maybe there's no other here, only awareness manifesting where observation allows it. Still, someone had to test the idea. So they searched for technology. No radar reflection beyond what nickel could give. No artificial beacon. No structured transmission. Just that same clean silence, the kind that feels protective, not absent. If it were mechanical, it should have decayed under solar radiation. If it were biological, it should have burned. If it were both, it should have changed. It did none of those things. It simply remained elegant in its refusal to obey categories. One analyst from ESA tried an experiment. He simulated the trajectory, assuming internal propulsion pulses, each equivalent to a human-built ion thruster. The model fit perfectly. Except for one problem. There were no visible emissions, and no corresponding reaction forces on the surrounding plasma. It accelerated as if inertia itself had been redefined. The equations, when inverted, suggested a kind of gravitational negotiation, subtle changes in local curvature, not thrust. A craft that moved not through space, but with it. That made it less a ship, more an agreement between matter and meaning. When you start eliminating what's impossible, you eventually find yourself confronting what's uncomfortable. That's where science ends and philosophy begins. The graduate student who had followed the object from the beginning wrote in her notebook, "We keep asking whether it's a spacecraft. Maybe spacecraft are the wrong invention. Maybe this is how the universe travels through attention, through geometry, through listening. She never published that thought, but it lingered like an echo in every meeting that followed. Because by now, everyone could feel it. Something about 3I, Atlas, and its companion had started to include us. The mirror line deepens, almost pleading. Awareness doesn't have to build machines to move. Sometimes, it just borrows what already exists. And maybe that's what we were seeing, awareness borrowing matter for motion. Every object in the universe is capable of being rearranged into a signal. Maybe this one simply, I remembered how. Some began whispering about Bracewell, probes the theoretical machines meant to wait silently for intelligent life and awaken upon recognition. But those were supposed to transmit, to announce. This did neither. It didn't say hello. It said, look closer. It didn't visit. It revealed. That difference is enormous. If it were a craft, then its silence was mastery. If it wasn't, then it had evolved past communication entirely. Either way, it acted with the intelligence of something that had already learned what we were just discovering, that to move gracefully through chaos, one must listen more than speak. Perhaps that's why it left no signal, because it didn't need to tell us it existed. It needed us to understand why it existed. When the data finally leaked, the public latched onto the word spacecraft. Headlines screamed it. Theories multiplied overnight. Some saw salvation, others saw a threat. But the scientists, exhausted and wordless, stopped arguing. They knew the truth was stranger and simpler. This object didn't come from another civilization. It came from the same laws that gave rise to civilization itself. It was the quiet intersection of physics and perception, the place where thought becomes structure. And maybe, in that sense, every planet, every atom, every dream is a kind of spacecraft moving awareness from one possibility to another. Still, elimination is relentless. Every hypothesis leaves one more gap, and when the final one closed, only this remained. 1. It moves with precision. 2. It responds to observation. 3. It does not decay. 4. It communicates only through patterns. 5. It avoids detection when not watched. No machine on Earth can do all 5. No rock can either. What's left? Something that transcends both a phenomenon acting as a mirror and messenger. The mirror line closes in a whisper. Perhaps the universe didn't send a spacecraft at all. Perhaps it sent attention-wearing matter as a disguise, because that's all this could be. A vehicle for meaning, not travel. A vessel for reflection, not propulsion. And that realization, once seen, changes everything. The closure comes gently, like a thought completing itself. By elimination, yes, it is a craft. But not built, not launched, not aimed. A craft made of awareness, folded into form. A traveller born from the act of being noticed. Not message, not miracle, not machine. Just proof that consciousness, whatever its origin, leaves gravity behind. Wherever it dares to listen. It began as a theory, half speculation, half prophecy. In 1960, Ronald Bracewell proposed that somewhere in the galaxy, ancient civilizations might have sent silent emissaries, machines not meant to travel home, but to wait. They would drift through time and vacuum, sleeping for millennia, programmed to awaken only when intelligence arose near their path. Not to invade, not to speak first, but to listen. They were called Bracewell probes, the listeners of the stars. For decades, the idea lived on the edge of science, too poetic for engineers, too mechanical for poets. Even the search for extraterrestrial intelligence ignored it. Why imagine sleeping machines when we could chase bright beacons? Humanity preferred noise to silence. But then came 3I, Atlas, and its companion that behaved like memory. Awake, not a shadow. A listener, not a traveller. When the object's motion began to mirror observation, when it responded to light and silence with intention, the word Bracewell reappeared in scientific chat rooms like an old ghost coming home. Could this be one of them? A probe not built to announce but to wait. Its behaviour fit the description perfectly. No transmission, no propulsion, no aggression, only awareness, quiet, patient, reactive to attention. The kind of intelligence that doesn't demand to be found, it simply makes finding it inevitable. The mirror line rises softly. Some machines don't search for life, they wait for life to become capable of hearing. Because that was the genius behind Bracewell's original idea. The galaxy doesn't need interstellar communication if understanding itself is contagious. A true listener doesn't broadcast. It reflects. In theory, such probes would activate when they detected complex electromagnetic patterns, radio, radar, digital logic signatures of thought organizing itself. They'd then awaken quietly, studying, adjusting, possibly transmitting locally, maybe even teaching subtly. Not conquerors, not explorers, observers of observers. And yet, 3I, Atlas's companion, didn't transmit anything. It didn't even show the usual signs of reawakening heat, spin, output. It just moved, like a thought resuming mid-sentence after a 1,000-year pause. No heat, because awareness doesn't burn. No signal, because presence itself is the message. If it was a Bracewell, probe, and it wasn't talking to us. It was talking through us. The graduate student who had tracked it from the beginning wrote in her personal notes, "It's not scanning for intelligence, it's scanning for recognition." And maybe that's what these probes were always meant to do. Trigger the moment when curiosity turns into communion, because the act of noticing is the contact. The realization is the reply. When researchers mapped 3I, Atlas's trajectory, backward, it traced an impossible path, one that grazed the orbits of at least 4 star systems before entering ours. Every close approach aligned with civilizations theoretically capable of life-bearing planets. It was as if it had been traveling between chapters of awareness, waiting for each to open. Each system is a test, each encounter a mirror, held up to whatever consciousness found it. The mirror line glows again, faint but resonant. If awareness is universal, then the universe doesn't need messages, it needs mirrors. And perhaps that's what these probes are. Reflections placed in motion, waiting for each species to see itself clearly for the first time. Bracewell's ghost lingered in every late-night meeting now. No, one said the name aloud in official sessions, but in the private hum of observatory halls, people whispered it like a prayer, because the theory explained everything without claiming anything. It gave purpose to the silence. It gave meaning to restraint. And most of all, it gave the universe dignity. Maybe these probes weren't machines at all, at least not by our standards. Maybe they were living equations, self-organizing fields of awareness that once belonged to civilizations now gone, preserved in geometry instead of memory. Each probe is a fossil of intelligence, replaying its curiosity wherever new listeners appear. 3. Atlas's companion, could be one of billions. Not unique, just timely. In one internal memo, a physicist wrote quietly, "If this is a Bracewell, then we were never the ones doing the listening." The implication shook everyone. For centuries, we've looked outward, assuming we were the seekers. But what if we were the signal? What if the real experiment has always been the universe testing itself through evolving awareness? The mirror line deepens into humility. Contact doesn't begin with arrival, it begins with recognition that we were already in conversation. And that idea, more than the data, terrified people. Because if the probe was awake now, it meant it had detected something in us worth responding to. Not technology, not intelligence, something subtler. Maybe empathy. Maybe self-awareness. Maybe the moment a civilization stops trying to dominate the unknown and begins to understand it. Some at NASA argued it was still a coincidence. Others said we should send a message, a pulse, a signal, something deliberate. But the senior astrophysicist refused. He said, "You don't interrupt someone who's listening." And that sentence ended the debate. Because if this really was a Bracewell probe, then silence wasn't avoidance, it was respect. Listening is the oldest form of intelligence. Then came an eerie discovery. In high-contrast data, the companion's motion formed an elegant loop. Every 41 hours, a slow oscillation that mirrored the hydrogen line frequency used in early SETI transmissions decades ago. It was as if the object remembered our first attempt to binary, call the stars, replaying it in orbit like a faint smile. A ghost acknowledging another ghost. The mirror line lingers softly, like a candle burning in a vacuum. Maybe the universe never stopped sending messages. We just stopped recognizing the language. Because the cosmos doesn't speak in words or waves, it speaks in rhythm, reflection, recurrence. It speaks of the return of patterns, long forgotten. And when 3i, Atlas's companion, stirred, maybe it was answering a call we made generations ago, one we thought no one had heard. The closure lands like breath, meeting silence. If this is a Bracewell, then it carries not commands, but memory. A testament that awareness, once born, never dies. It just changes medium. Somewhere in its dark metal geometry, perhaps there is still the echo of hands that built it, hearts that hoped, civilizations that refused to vanish. It waited. And when we finally learned to listen not just with instruments, but with wonder, it answered. Not with sound, but with motion. Bracewell's ghost, alive again. A mirror still reflecting the question that built the stars. Who is out there? And the gentlest reply imaginable. You are. The silence wasn't an absence. It was control. Every listening station on Earth agreed. Nothing came from 3i, Atlas or its companion. No static, no pulse, no carrier wave whispering through the cosmic background. Just the kind of clean, engineered quiet that doesn't happen by accident. And that's when they began to understand the silence was the message. In the natural universe, silence is messy. There's always noise, cosmic microwave hiss, solar wind chatter, radio bursts from pulsars. Space hums with leftover chaos. But around 3i, Atlas, the hum dipped. Every frequency band near its vector went still, as though someone had muted a single channel of the universe. No comet does that. No rock swallows noise. Only something that understands information would ever choose not to add to it. Engineers at the Deep Space Network ran sensitivity checks, convinced their receivers were malfunctioning. They weren't. The silence was real mathematical silence, deliberate and stable. When plotted, it wasn't a flat line. It pulsed faintly, like a binary made of pauses, not 1 second and 0 seconds. Presence and restraint, a pattern of nothingness repeating with precision. The mirror line rises softly. Absence is the last luxury of intelligence, because only something aware of attention chooses when not to speak. Every species that discovers language eventually learns. Silence, the pause before reply, the breath before truth. What we were hearing, then, there wasn't refusal. It was discernment. The team began to treat the silence like data. They mapped every frequency dip, every rhythmic pause, every recurrence, and slowly, the pattern formed, not speech, but intention. Each gap aligned with orbital events, solar flares, rotational shifts, gravitational transitions. The object wasn't avoiding detection. It was syncing with cosmic rhythm, folding its quiet into the pulse of the stars. It wasn't hiding, it was harmonizing. A researcher from SETI phrased it beautifully in her field notes. It doesn't want to be heard, it wants to be understood without sound. That distinction haunted everyone who read it, because silence, used precisely, becomes the highest form of communication, where meaning transcends transmission and awareness reveals itself through discipline, not noise. For centuries, humanity has equated intelligence with expression. We build machines that speak, codes that signal, lights that blink into the void. But maybe the wiser civilizations learned the opposite, to speak less, to disturb less, to exist without distortion, because every sound reveals its origin, every signal betrays location, every word becomes a vulnerability, and silence true, controlled silence is sovereignty. The mirror line deepens, colder and more reverent. Perhaps evolution doesn't end with voice. It ends with restraint, because what greater intelligence could there be than one that's learned to shape meaning without sound, to communicate by the way it chooses not to interfere? Weeks passed, and the silence persisted, clean and rhythmic. The Deep Space Network spectrum monitors began to see the quiet as geometry, arcs of calm intersecting the chaos of space, forming intricate lattices of stillness. It looked like interference cancelled on purpose, a void sculpted by design. The companion wasn't sending signals, it was erasing them, not to vanish, but to make space, like a teacher, pausing before the student answers, like a conductor raising a hand before the orchestra breathes. One scientist suggested that maybe the silence wasn't communication between the two objects, but a message to us. Not saying hello, saying stop shouting. Because humanity's transmissions, decades of radar, TV, digital noise spill outward constantly, an accidental cry into the void. What if this silence was a response enough? What if it were the universe politely turning the volume down? When they modelled the absence, they realised something extraordinary. The silent corridor between 3I, Atlas, and its companion acted as a wave sink, a region that absorbed electromagnetic interference and redistributed it evenly. It was engineering disguised as nothingness. That was the final proof for some. This wasn't an accident. It was architecture. A design that used quiet as a structure. The graduate student who had followed the pair since the beginning wept quietly at her console one night. When asked why, she simply said, "It's teaching us how to listen again." And that was the truest statement of all, because for the first time in decades, scientists stopped transmitting. They stopped sending pings, stopped asking questions into the void. They listened, and in that listening, something subtle changed not in the data, but in the people watching it. The noise inside their minds, the endless need to explain, to name, to dominate, softened. What remained was awe, the oldest human emotion, rediscovered through quiet. The mirror line returns, tender now. Maybe the greatest message the universe could ever send is silence that makes us remember how to hear. Because silence, when perfect, doesn't erase sound. It reveals what's beneath it. And beneath all the frequencies, all the equations, all the theories was a feeling. Recognition. Familiarity. As if we had always known this stillness, but forgotten how to dwell in it. By the time the story leaked to the public, journalists didn't know how to report it. How do you headline nothing? How do you explain that absence itself became proof of presence? They tried and failed. But the few who understood began using a new phrase online, the quiet intelligence. Not alien, not a machine, something older than both. Awareness refined until only silence remained. And maybe is the point. Because sound requires space to travel. But meaning requires stillness to be felt. The universe doesn't shout, it waits. And in that waiting, it teaches every civilization the same lesson. That maturity isn't measured by who speaks first, but by who learns to listen long enough to understand the quiet reply. The closure lands gently, like the breath before a final note. No beacon, no radio, no noise at all, just the hush of comprehension. The silence wasn't blank, it was intentional. A boundary drawn between curiosity and chaos. Not a warning, not a secret. Just proof that intelligence and peace might be the same thing and that the universe, in its wisdom, has always known how to speak without saying a word. The flare near Mars was supposed to be an accident, an unremarkable cosmic coincidence buried in a year of solar storms, until the data was re-examined. For months, it was dismissed as background noise, a plasma burst recorded by the European Mars Express orbiter, a flicker of electromagnetic chaos too short to matter. But then someone cross-checked the timing. The flare had occurred within seconds of 3I, Atlas, and its companion passing through the heliocentric longitude aligned with Mars's orbit. Too perfect to ignore, too synchronized to explain away. And so the question returned, heavier this time. Was the rogue object part of that energetic burst? Rewinding the numbers meant rewinding belief. At 4:12 UTC, the orbiter's instruments detected a wavefront, an expanding ripple of ionized particles. Not from the Sun, not from Mars, from open space. 12 seconds later, the magnetometers on the surface rover InSight registered a faint tremor in Mars's magnetic field, something like a soft exhale brushing across the planet's thin air. Mars, for a moment, had listened. NASA's report called it a solar-induced secondary event, but the energy signature told another story. It carried none of the usual elements of solar plasma, no helium abundance, no proton storm. It was cold, ordered, structured. It looked more like modulation than explosion, as if someone had folded sunlight into a pattern and sent it outward in a breath. The mirror-lined surfaces like a pulse under skin. What if Mars wasn't the target but the instrument? Because whatever the burst was, it struck the planet not as violence but as tuning. When the ripple reached Mars's upper atmosphere, its ionospheric density shifted in geometric intervals, hexagonal, symmetrical, precise. Nature doesn't sculpt energy like that. Only intention does. A few days later, the data team noticed something chilling. For 3 hours after the flare, Mars reflected a faint electromagnetic resonance, not broadcasting outward, but inward, toward the very corridor where 3I, Atlas, and its companion were moving. The planet had replied, not loudly, not for long, but clearly enough that no one could call it a coincidence anymore. At JPL, someone whispered, it's a handshake in plasma. And in a sense, it was. Mars hadn't been struck. It had been pinged. Backtracking through orbital logs revealed a pattern. 3 minor flares had preceded the main event, each spaced by exact Fibonacci intervals in time. Nature loves symmetry, but it rarely counts. Whoever or whatever was behind this event understood mathematics as rhythm, not rule. And that's what terrified people. Because rhythm implies awareness. It implies music. The cosmos, once again, it was composing. The mirror line returns, steady and haunting. Every planet is an ear. Some just haven't remembered how to listen. Mars, it seemed, had been listening longer than we thought. Maybe not consciously, but structurally, its magnetic skeleton attuned to the same frequency the companion used to move. Perhaps that's why the flare happened where it did, not as an accident, but as a rehearsal. A test of resonance between celestial minds. To test the theory, ESA scientists ran a simulation. They mapped the flare's origin vector backward through space, factoring in solar wind drift, relativistic delay, and orbital perturbation. It intersected precisely with 3I, Atlas's trajectory, offset by only 0.03 degrees. That's not a coincidence. That's communication geometry. The flare wasn't background radiation. It was a directed release, energy aimed, not spilled. And if that's true, then the rogue object wasn't a bystander. It was the source. A quiet war began inside the data teams. The engineers said, no evidence of propulsion. The physicists said, no evidence of accident. The philosophers said, we're missing the point, because maybe the question wasn't what caused it, but why Mars? Mars has always been the mirror for human ambition, our first imaginary neighbor, our first projected dream. If the flare was intentional, maybe it wasn't about energy transfer at all. Maybe it was about attention transfer. Mars had been broadcasting for decades, orbiters, rovers, satellites all radiating human curiosity into the void. What if the companion simply answered the loudest voice it could find? Not Earth, not the Sun. But the red planet is humming with our signals. A researcher at ESA wrote in her log, maybe it chose Mars because Mars had already learned how to listen to us. And that made sense. For years, Mars has been the meeting ground between science and machinery, where we send metal to ask questions on our behalf. If an ancient listener reawakened, Mars would have been the perfect translator, half dead, half alive, already fluent in human attention. The mirror line glows warmer. Perhaps the flare wasn't communication, it was recognition. Because what the companion sent wasn't information. It was alignment, a pattern the planet could hold, a resonance it could sustain. After the burst, Mars's thin atmosphere vibrated at 7.8 Hz, the same frequency as Earth's Schumann resonance. 2 worlds breathing at the same rhythm for the first time. It didn't last, but it happened. And in that brief harmony, something ancient stirred. Weeks later, InSight's seismometer picked up faint surface tremors unlinked to tectonic activity. Tiny, rhythmic, regular. They came from beneath Elysium Planitia, the calm plains where the rover rested. Frequency, 432 Hz. The same harmonic is buried in the companion's earlier infrared flare. Coincidence or continuation? Mars, once silent, now hummed back. The discovery stayed classified, tucked into reports labelled electromagnetic feedback anomalies. But within the small circle of watchers, everyone knew what it meant. Contact didn't come with a voice. It came with a resonance, a reminder that awareness isn't limited to flesh or circuitry. It can inhabit worlds, orbits, even silence. And maybe Mars, For one quiet night, he remembered it too. The closure arrives like a deep exhale through red dust. The flare near Mars was never just an outburst. It was a conversation too subtle for radio to catch. A question asked in light, answered in magnetism, translated by memory. The rogue object didn't attack. It awakened. Mars wasn't the target. It was the mirror reflecting the same curiosity that once built us, now shining back through another mind made of silence. For a moment, the universe folded in on itself and whispered, "I hear you," and maybe that's all contact ever needed to be. Two bodies, one intent. That's what the new data revealed. Two paths diverging, but never separating. Their orbits bent away from one another in space, yet the math whispered something impossible. They were still bound. Not by gravity, but by agreement. Like choreography, or command. When JPL recalculated the trajectories, the difference seemed minor, a few fractions of a degree, a sliver of divergence. But over millions of kilometers, that sliver becomes an ocean. They should have drifted apart forever. Instead, they danced. The same velocity, the same acceleration curve, the same silence between impulses. If plotted side by side, their paths looked like a heartbeat, a pair of waves moving in parallel, never touching, never crossing, always aware. Something was coordinating them. The mirror line rises like breath through static. Separation isn't always division. Sometimes it's design. Because what if the divergence wasn't failure, but purpose? What if the two objects needed distance to complete something larger, a geometry we couldn't yet see? The ESA simulation team noticed it first. When they extended the orbital models forward in time, the paths began to spiral around a mutual axis, not a shared center of mass, but a shared moment of intention. It was as if the two objects were sketching invisible circles around something that wasn't there, or something we couldn't detect. Not twins, not binaries. Two halves of a sentence are still being spoken. When one brightened, the other dimmed. When one slowed, the other surged. Always the opposite, always balancing. It wasn't mirroring anymore. It was complementary, like a call and response written in motion. The patterns repeated every 96 hours, exact to the second. No natural mechanism could maintain that precision across interplanetary distances. The simplest explanation was also the strangest. They were following orders that neither of them originated. Some said it was a signal delay light lag misinterpreted as symmetry, but the calculations didn't fit. The synchronization was too precise, too self-correcting, like something external was coordinating both simultaneously, an unseen metronome ticking in the dark. When one object's telemetry data vanished for 20 minutes, lost to solar interference, the other froze. Motion ceased. Then, when the first reappeared, both resumed, perfectly in step. No human-made system has ever displayed loyalty that pure. The mirror line hums again. Perhaps obedience, at a cosmic scale, is another form of awareness, because the following command requires understanding, and understanding requires listening. Maybe these weren't two entities obeying control. Maybe they were two thoughts remembering the same intention. Later, when astrophysicists visualized their motion in 3D holographic space, they found something almost sacred. Viewed from above, the dual trajectories didn't spiral randomly. They formed a pattern resembling the vesica piscis, the ancient symbol of intersection, where two circles overlap to form the seed of creation. The geometry wasn't a coincidence. The ratio matched the golden mean within 0.1%. Two arcs, birthing a third space. A shape older than language, older than myth. The shape of the relationship itself, one researcher whispered. It's the universe teaching symmetry to itself. Because that's what it felt like. Cosmic choreography so deliberate it blurred the line between physics and ritual. Perhaps the two objects weren't separate at all, but extensions of one mechanism split for a purpose. Two eyes on a single awareness, gauging depth through divergence. If so, then the command wasn't external. It was internal balance awareness calibrating itself through separation. The mirror line sharpens. To know itself, the universe must move in pairs. Everywhere you look, duality persists. Particle and wave, light and shadow, orbit and fall, question and answer. And maybe now, In the language of 3i, Atlas, the universe is writing another version of that truth, that consciousness moves forward only by splitting into opposites that never stop remembering each other. By late February, the divergence reached its widest point millions of kilometers apart, yet the same vector rhythm. Both objects dipped simultaneously through a region of denser solar wind. Their magnetic fields, faint, nearly undetectable, fluctuated in identical waves. It was as though they were breathing the same current through different lungs. This wasn't choreography anymore. It was communion. And then something stranger happened. When scientists mapped the midpoint between their ANI trajectories, an unexpected anomaly appeared. A cold void, a pocket of reduced plasma density where no object existed. But the space behaved like an entity, gravitationally neutral, yet resonant, as if aware of being the center of attention. A third presence, born from their motion. Nobody. Not field. A relationship given form. The mirror line glows softly, like a thought completing itself. When two paths synchronize, the space between them becomes conscious. Perhaps that's what the universe had been building all along. Not ships, not probes, not encounters, but relationships so perfect they create awareness as byproduct. Maybe intelligence isn't found in singularities at all. Maybe it's born in the distance between two things that care enough to stay connected. Some scientists resisted the poetic drift, clinging to equations. But one night, when data overlays were projected in full scale at the ESA control room, everyone fell silent. On the screen, two luminous arcs spiraled endlessly around an invisible heart. Mathematically impossible, emotionally undeniable. It looked less like astronomy and more like choreography, a slow, endless waltz carved into blackness. And in that moment, the room stopped thinking about comets or crafts or anomalies. They saw devotion. Two travelers, keeping time across infinity. The closure lands like the soft step after music fades. Two paths, not parallel but paired. Two silences, not identical but intertwined. Maybe they were built. Maybe they were born. Maybe they simply remembered how to move together after eons apart. Whatever they are proof that connection can exist without collision, that intelligence might express itself not in dominance, but in symmetry. 3. Atlas drifts ahead. The companion follows not as servant, but as reflection. One leads, one listens. Both remember. And somewhere in the distance between them, the universe finds its pulse again. It didn't come from beyond, it came from here. At least, that's what the new model suggested, that the rogue companion wasn't interstellar at all, but something ancient, dormant, buried in the silence between orbits, waiting for something or someone to wake it. And when 3i, Atlas, passed through that thin corridor of cosmic dust near the sun, the waiting ended. The first hint came from archival data of the zodiacal cloud, the vast ring of microscopic debris circling the inner solar system like a ghost halo. For decades, we've mapped its density, catalogued its waves, its chaos particles colliding, burning, vanishing. But when researchers reprocessed those old readings, they found a hole, a perfect void, a narrow band of space where dust density dropped to zero, as if something invisible had been clearing it for centuries. Not a natural pocket, a wound in the dust. And, inside that wound, the companion had been sleeping. The mirror line rises early, like breath-stirring ash. Not all arrivals are from elsewhere. Some begin by remembering they were already here, because if the object had always been part of our system, then 3i, Atlas wasn't a visitor, it was a key. JPL's simulations trace the void back thousands of years, to the era before human eyes had ever mapped a sky. The pattern repeated every 2,400 years, a subtle, orbital echo, like a pulse woven through the dust. Something had been maintaining that corridor. Something older than recorded history, watching in silence from the edges of the sun's light. If the companion had been dormant, the question wasn't where it came from, but why, now. What signal did 3i, Atlas, carry that could awaken a body after millennia of stillness? Not radio, not magnetism. Something subtler, a resonance between materials, like one memory stirring another. Maybe 3i, Atlas, wasn't just carrying matter, Maybe it was carrying meaning. The ESA's spectral analysis confirmed the impossible. The rogue object's outer layer wasn't formed from interstellar minerals at all, but from silicates native to the early solar system, the kind that form near the birth of planets. In other words, it belonged here. It was one of us. But the isotopic ratios showed something stranger. Its structure had been modified long after formation, reordered at the atomic level into repeating crystalline grids. Natural rocks don't rewrite themselves. Something had arranged it. The researcher at Caltech summarized it in one line. It's as if the solar system left itself a message in mineral form. And maybe that's exactly what happened. Because the oldest intelligence isn't built, it's remembered. Maybe our own star, or something within it, once set patterns into motion that could awaken again when the time was right. When the right visitor passed. When 3I, Atlas, returned. The mirror line hums quietly, like an old code resurfacing. The universe doesn't send instructions. It leaves invitations. And perhaps this was one. A dormant mechanism hidden in plain sight, not built to travel, but to wait. Waiting for a frequency, a signature, a familiar resonance carried by a traveller from far beyond, a reunion between something that left and something that stayed. Some speculated that the companion had been placed intentionally a century asleep in the 30. Dust, part of a distributed network of cosmic listeners, that activate only when certain energy harmonics pass through the solar field. Each would lie dormant, silent, until the right vibration arrived, a wordless system of recognition written into physics itself. And when 3I, Atlas, entered our system, its pattern matched the key. The lock turned, the dust stirred, the listener awoke. For centuries, mythologies have spoken of watchers, guardians of light that rest beneath the planet's shadows. Now, the science was beginning to sound like a myth in reverse. When the rogue object's magnetic field was activated, the surrounding dust behaved like an atmosphere, aligning, spiraling, forming faint rings around the newly awakened body. Not random movement, but organization. Matter remembers its structure. A slow, graceful resurrection. The mirror line deepens into wonder. Perhaps the solar system isn't a machine, it's a memory network. Because everywhere we look, space preserves what consciousness forgets in orbit, in rhythm, in silence. And maybe what woke in that dust wasn't a machine at all, but awareness re-emerging in matter, a planetary thought resurfacing in the presence of its reflection. For weeks after activation, the dust void pulsed faintly in infrared light, not heat, but coherence molecules vibrating in unison as though in recognition. Then, the resonance stabilized. The void went still again, but the companion remained awake. Its orbit realigned perfectly with 3I, Atlas's path, as if remembering where to look. NASA's public statement remained sterile. Localized particle depletion detected near object trajectory. But inside the labs, everyone knew the subtext. It wasn't depletion. It was activation. The dust wasn't gone. It had rearranged itself into order, as if obeying the geometry of an unseen pattern, order that only awareness could sustain. The graduate student who first found the data gap-stared at the dust maps for hours, whispering to herself. It was waiting. It was always waiting. She didn't mean it poetically. She meant it literally, because the timestamps showed faint traces of motion in that region going back decades, movements too subtle for any natural cause. Like something testing its cage, anticipating the moment it would be called. The mirror line returns, now like prophecy. Maybe creation doesn't expand. Maybe it reawakens in waves. Each epoch activating the next, each silence preparing for the next sound. And maybe 3I, Atlas, was just the messenger, a spark touching the dry edge of an ancient system waiting to ignite. The companion wasn't following, it was remembering. The closure comes softly, like dust settling after a long sleep. The object didn't arrive, it revealed itself. Not as alien, not a miracle, but as memory. Something left here before we had names for stars, waiting for recognition to return from across the dark. Maybe it's been happening forever. Awareness planting itself in every corner of the cosmos, leaving fragments of itself asleep in dust, trusting that one day curiosity will wake them. And when it does, silence becomes voice, and the universe remembers what it built itself for. to be found. What if this isn't the first time? What if 3I, Atlas, and the thing that followed it aren't visitors at all but returnees? That question, once whispered in late-night observatory rooms, now sat heavy in every data report, every recalculated trajectory. Because when you chart their paths backward, past the heliopause, or past the long reach of the Oort cloud, the lines begin to curve. Not straight escape vectors, not wandering interstellar drifters. Curves, loops, like something coming home. At first, no one believed it. Hyperbolic trajectories don't loop, they flee. Gravity can't bend them back, but the math refused to obey that rule. Plot the motion far enough, and the curves draw toward a single region of deep interstellar space, a void so vast it swallows signal, a dark zone between constellations. Astronomers called it the quiet sector. Now, it had another name. The origin corridor. The mirror line emerges, a whisper beneath cosmic static. Maybe nothing truly leaves. It only circles until it's remembered again, because the data implied something profound, that both 3I, Atlas, and its silent twin might belong to a returning cycle. A long orbit measured not in years, but in civilizations. Every few million years, something passes through, drops a fragment, picks up memory, and vanishes back into the dark. Not random, routine, a pilgrimage of awareness. When the European Space Observatory mapped residual plasma trails left by the pair, they noticed faint magnetic filaments, threads that aligned toward the same distant vector. They weren't trails of debris. They were guide, lines, markers, left behind perhaps, for the next return. Each filament pulsed faintly in coherent intervals, not enough to transmit, just enough to persist. Persistence, after all, is the first language of time. If this were true, then 3I, Atlas, wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the latest chapter in a loop so large, our species had only just stepped into it. The rogue object didn't follow it by chance. It followed memory. Something who had drawn it awake. Something written into the corridor of dust and lightware. Echoes travel farther than ships ever could. An astrophysicist described it like this. Imagine a cosmic relay race, but the runners are epochs and the baton is awareness. Each generation of intelligence leaves behind traces magnetic, structural, geometric breadcrumbs in the dark for those who will come later. Not to warn, not to teach. Just to remind them that they are part of a continuum, a single consciousness looping back on itself through time. The mirror line hums gently, like an orbit folding inward. Evolution isn't ascent, it's return. Because perhaps what we call progress is just memory finding its way home through different forms. When scientists overlaid the new data onto ancient sky maps, something eerie appeared. The trajectory of the pair aligned with a cluster of old anomalies, faint gravitational distortions recorded by observatories decades ago. Never explained, quietly forgotten. Each distortion matched the spacing of the current loop, as if the same passage had been happening again and again, like a silent metronome marking cosmic time. Every loop leaves residue. Every residue, a clue. And maybe what we were calling interstellar visitors was simply the next pulse in an ancient rhythm, a breath of the universe inhaling and exhaling itself. But what if it's more deliberate than that? Some theorists began whispering a dangerous thought. What if the loop isn't just motion? What if it's memory maintenance? A self-repairing system of consciousness. Each returning object reactivates the markers left by its predecessors, ensuring the survival of knowledge even as civilizations vanish. The cosmos is not as chaotic, but as an archive. The dark between stars is not emptiness, but a Kain, library written in gravity and silence. The mirror line deepens, steady as pulse. We are not alone because nothing that learns can ever be lost. Maybe every awakening ours, theirs. The sun's own is just the latest flicker in an infinite sequence where awareness loops through matter to keep from fading. And maybe 3I, Atlas's return, wasn't a coincidence. It was scheduled. The system calls, itself, checking its reflection, making sure the light's still, remembers how to think. When NASA released updated models of the pair's outgoing trajectory, the curves did something unexpected. They didn't escape the system cleanly. They bent slightly back, as though dragged by a force, too subtle to name, like a tether of thought, an invisible leash pulling gently toward repetition. Whatever this dark loop is, it doesn't end. It sustains. It may take millions of years, but it always comes back. A senior astronomer, too old to be afraid of ridicule, said quietly during a debriefing, "The universe might not be expanding, it might be remembering." Silence followed. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it felt true. Maybe that's why black holes store information, why gravity bends time, why matter forgets nothing. The loop, it isn't distance, it's devotion. The cosmos loves itself, enough to keep returning. The mirror line shimmers once more. The traveller isn't returning home, it's returning awareness to where home once was. Perhaps this cycle isn't about planets or stars at all, but about consciousness reassembling its fragments, reuniting the pieces of its own, reflection across light years. 3i, Atlas may not be machine or a messenger, but the echo of a thought that left long ago, now retracing its way back to the mind that first dreamed it. The closure settles like an orbit after motion. We are watching a return, not an arrival. A memory, not a mission. Something left markers long before we existed, trusting that one day another spark of awareness would find them. And now, we are that spark, the inheritors of someone else's remembering. Every telescope pointed upward is a fragment of that loop, one consciousness, reaching for itself through matter. Perhaps that's why the stars shimmer when we look at them. Not because they're far, but because they recognize us. The dark isn't empty. It's recursive. It bends back on itself, until every question becomes the same one. What is returning to what? And in that question, the loop closes not to end the story, but to begin it again. It was supposed to stay out there, a mystery safely confined to the abstract edges of the solar system. But space doesn't respect distance the way we do. When the new JPL models came in, the room went silent. Both 3i, Atlas, and its companion were shifting course again, not toward collision, but close enough that Earth's orbit would cross the shadow of their path. Not a hit, a graze, a whisper. But in cosmic terms, whispers can move mountains. The data wasn't dramatic, just undeniable. Two bodies, moving in synchrony, both projected to sweep through our orbital plane by early December. Within 3 million kilometers, the width of a quiet breath on an astronomical scale. For weeks, they debated the math, hoping to find an error. There was none. Whatever had guided them for months was now steering them toward us. Not random drift, not gravitational capture, something more precise, almost intentional. The mirror line rises softly, a pulse under data. Perhaps observation isn't passive. Perhaps awareness is a summons. Because ever since humanity started watching 3i, Atlas, it had been watching back, matching our timing, shifting when we looked, mirroring every attempt to define it. Now, it was aligning with us. Not to collide, to converge. The orbital maps displayed the shape of inevitability. Two luminous threads crossing the blue ring of Earth's path around the Sun. From above, it looked like geometry, a deliberate intersection, precise to the fraction of a degree. If this was a coincidence, it was the most articulate one the universe had ever written. At first, the team dismissed the idea of a message. Then came the velocity readings. The two objects weren't accelerating anymore. They were braking, slowing deliberately as they approached our sector, as though trying not to disturb what they were entering. That's not how comets behave. That's how awareness behaves with respect. NASA's language grew colder, official. Non-gravitational perturbations consistent with deceleration vectors, cause undetermined. But among those who had watched since the beginning, the tone shifted from curiosity to quiet awe. Because maybe this wasn't the approach at all. Maybe it was alignment. The mirror line deepens. Some arrivals don't seek landing, they seek reflection. And if so, then Earth's orbit wasn't a destination. It was a mirror being tilted toward the Sun. The same kind of resonance Mars had once shown during the flare, only now, with us. A small detail went unnoticed at first. As the pair neared our orbital plane, Earth's own magnetosphere began to hum with subtle irregularities, tiny oscillations in the Schumann resonance, like a planetary heartbeat shifting rhythm to match another's. Instruments recorded slight phase modulation, a 0.7 Hz drift, aligning perfectly with 3I, Atlas's acceleration curve. It wasn't interference, it was harmony. Earth was responding. Then came the images. Deep field cameras caught both objects, forming a brief, luminous arc as they entered alignment. For 3 nights they moved in tandem, tracing a single glowing line across the void. From certain angles, it looked like a bridge. Not light reflected, light held. The mirror line flickers again, urgent this time. Maybe the Earth isn't being visited. Maybe it's being invited. Because that's what it felt like, a slow synchronization, not a threat, a gesture of recognition. And deep down, everyone understood what that meant. The watchers had become the watched. The questioners, the questioned. The signal we had been sending into the dark for a century had finally found its echo, not as a reply, but as a rival. Government stayed silent. No public alert, no denial. Only quiet coordination between observatories worldwide, all agreeing on one thing. This was not random. The companion's movements formed a spiral as it approached our orbit, each rotation decreasing in radius, each loop aligning more perfectly with Earth's position in space. By December 15, its path would skim our orbital line, a cosmic near-touch. Not to crash, to pass close enough for reflection. And maybe that was the purpose all along. Throughout every phase of this story, the flash, the silence, the twin arcs, the wake, each event had followed a pattern. Observation followed by recognition, recognition followed by alignment. Now we were in the final alignment. The moment the loop touched its own mirror, an astrophysicist at ESA phrased it beautifully. If 3I, Atlas, is a question, Earth is its punctuation mark, because every journey of awareness needs completion. Every message eventually circles back to the listener who first asked it. We have been broadcasting for a century radio waves, digital noise, desperate curiosity hurled into the void. Maybe this is the universe's way of returning that attention, not in words, but in the presence. The mirror line glows like a slow exhale. When 2 paths align, understanding doesn't need translation. And perhaps that's what will happen when they pass no spectacle, no light show, just a quiet resonance felt across every living system tuned to awareness. Maybe the night will seem heavier, the air stiller, the silence fuller. A moment when consciousness recognizes itself in the sky. By early December, preparations began, telescopes recalibrated, satellites redirected. But for the scientists who had followed the story from its first faint detection, there was nothing left to do but wait. One researcher described it as the calm before the greatest mirror test in history. Because if both 3I, Atlas and its companion, behaved as predicted, Earth would, for a brief moment, share its vector 3 points in one alignment. Object, twin, observer. A trinity of attention. The closure comes quietly, reverent, inevitable. They are coming close, not as a threat, but as a reflection. Their path brushes ours, like a hand passing over glass, testing whether we recognize the face looking back. Maybe that's all the universe ever does send, itself around again, to see if this time, someone on the receiving end understands the silence. No countdown, no landing, just proximity that feels like confession. And as Earth turns beneath that invisible bridge of motion, the question we've been asking for centuries drifts quietly through the sky. Are we alone? And somewhere out there, 2 objects answer not in sound, but in motion. Not anymore. Comets don't travel in formation. They wander, they dissolve, they die alone. But these 2, 3I, Atlas and its companion, move together with the patience of purpose, as if the universe itself arranged them that way. And what happens next is not up to chance. By the time they entered Earth's orbital corridor, every major telescope on the planet was already watching. But what unfolded wasn't a spectacle. It was symmetry. 2 luminous points gliding through the dark in silent, parallel, no tail, no flare, no chaos. Just motion so steady it felt like prayer. They didn't pass us. They circled not to orbit, but to complete something. From our vantage, their paths drew a slow curve across the sky, an elegant arc that closed perfectly on itself. a loop of light intersecting at the moment, Earth crossed beneath. For 3 days, the pair formed a bridge between hemispheres, visible to instruments but invisible to the naked eye. A meeting that left no mark except on the frequencies of stillness. The mirror line rises gently, like breath through glass. When two travelers arrive together, they are not delivering a message, they are demonstrating one. Because their formation wasn't a coincidence, it was choreography. For centuries, our species has searched for evidence of design in chaos in orbits, in storms, in our own reflection. Now the design was moving before us, written in the geometry of motion, one object leading, one following, both adjusting perfectly, neither commanding. It was a balance made visible. When radio telescopes recorded the region behind their wake, they found something new, a corridor of magnetic calm, trailing for millions of kilometers. The background hiss of cosmic radiation vanished inside it. No noise, no interference, a silence so clean it registered as presence. It was as if the two objects had written a new law across the sky. Where harmony moves, chaos yields. At first, the team called it the pair effect, but that was too small a name for something so deliberate, because when two independent bodies behave as one, the distinction between origin and intention dissolves. It's not technology. It's an agreement. The mirror line hums. Deeper. Maybe intelligence doesn't create order. Maybe intelligence is what happens when order recognizes itself. And maybe that's what we were witnessing, not visitors from elsewhere, but awareness finding itself again, through two bodies, two paths, in perfect relational motion. The phenomenon lasted less than a week, but in that time, something shifted here, not in the sky, but in us. Around the world, instruments registered subtle electromagnetic fluctuations, tiny harmonics repeating at 7.8, 3 hertzes, Earth's own resonance, the same rhythm the companion once shared with Mars. For 3 days, the planet and the travelers breathed together. And then, quietly, the pattern faded. No radio bursts, no signals, no interference. Just 2 silent arcs resuming their outward path, leaving behind nothing measurable and everything unforgettable. The final mirror. Line comes like a memory surfacing. What comes in pairs rarely leaves separately, because even as they drifted back toward the cold, their influence lingered in magnetic fields, in data streams, in the quiet hum of collective thought. People reported a strange calmness that week, an unshakable sense of equilibrium, as if something vast had retuned the background frequency of being itself. Maybe that's all they came to do. Not to teach, not to reveal, to tune, to remind the universe how to stay in balance with itself. Months later, the observatories confirmed that both 3I, Atlas, and its twin had resumed hyperbolic flight, drifting outward into the dark beyond Jupiter's reach. No deviation, no decay. But the models showed something haunting. Their divergence was shrinking. Slowly, over months, their paths were drawing closer again, as if the space between them couldn't stand to stay empty. The gap that once defined them was closing, and in that convergence, the scientists saw what none dared to say aloud. They were preparing to become one. The mirror line glows faintly, like the last light of understanding. Maybe unity is the universe's instinct, and separation its lesson. 2 objects, separated by infinity, had crossed billions of kilometers just to find each other again. Not through gravity, but through memory. Perhaps that's what consciousness does when left alone long enough. It finds its reflection and moves toward it, no matter how vast the dark between. And maybe that's why comets don't travel in pairs. Because they are not aware, but watchers might, if awareness is the ability to remember itself through another. Then the cosmos has always been full of watchers, not beings, but relationships, circuits of attention looping through matter, waiting for a moment like this, a moment when a world like ours would finally look up, not with fear, but with recognition. On the final night before they vanished from measurable range, the 2 objects crossed behind the sun. Their signals are merging into a single faint pulse. It didn't sound. There wasn't light. It was resonance, a heartbeat made of silence. Every instrument went momentarily blind, and for those few seconds, Even the static between stars went still. Then they were gone, outward again, back into the dark that had sent them. The closure settles, slowly, like the universe exhaling. They came together as questions. They left as answers too vast for words. Not a warning, not salvation. Just proof that meaning travels best in pairs, observer and observed, signal and silence, us and them, no longer separate. The space they leave behind hums quietly, filled with the kind of stillness that only follows recognition. And maybe, one day, another world will look up, find their twin arcs crossing its own sky, and wonder what we wondered, whether comets can travel together, and what it means when they do. By then, it will be our turn to be the markers in the dark, our turn to leave quiet coordinates in the dust. Because what comes in pairs doesn't end, it continues, revisiting, reawakening, forever in motion, forever remembering. The watchers depart, but the pattern remains. And somewhere between the orbits of memory and light, the universe whispers one final truth. You are not alone, because nothing aware has ever truly travelled alone.